let me just quick draw the connection for you between chapter 2 and chapter 24 of Joshua, because that's kind of interesting. So go to Judges chapter 2, verse 1. It's an interesting phrase that I don't know that I've heard too many people ever preach or talk about this phrase, but it's interesting. Judges 2, verse 1. It says, "Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochum," and then he starts declaring something to Joshua about how they're not being faithful to the covenant. So it's interesting. He says, the angel of the Lord went from Gilgal to Bochum, and starts talking to Joshua about how they're not being faithful to the covenant. Now, Gilgal was the last time we heard mention of the angel of the Lord. Remember, Joshua is getting ready to fight at Jericho, and he has an encounter with the angel of the Lord, and that's where he gets the battle plan to march around Jericho. And the angel of the Lord, he says, are you for us or for our enemies? And he says, neither. I have come as the commander of the hosts of the army of the Lord. Take off your shoes, for the ground whereon you is holy. And so that was the last time, and that was at Gilgal. And so it's an interesting phrase. It says, now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal and went to Bochum. Now, Bochum, they're not 100% sure where that is, but if you, in Joshua 24, where it talks about this story there, it says Shechem, right? Which is also the hill country. So Shechem is in Ephraim. So that's the hill country. So the plains is where Gilgal is, because that's right near Jericho. So Jericho is that first battle when they come in, and that's a plain kind of area. And so Gilgal was in flat land in the plains. Ephraim is farther north, and Shiloh is there, Shechem is there, and wherever this place Bochum is, archaeologists still are not sure entirely where that is, but it's got to be right there at Shechem, because in 24, when he's talking about this same speech, he says that all of the people were gathered there at Shechem, right? And so it's all kind of interrelated in that same mountainous kind of area, hilly area there in northern Ephraim is Shiloh and Shechem and this Bochum place where the angel of the Lord goes. And so the angel of the Lord in chapter 2 of Judges gives this quick, it's only a couple of lines where he says, you're not faithful to the covenant. But what Joshua 24 is several paragraphs about what the Lord had said to Joshua. And so Joshua 24 is the full or a fuller version of what the angel of the Lord said to Joshua that we're only getting a sentence or two of here in Judges chapter 2, right? And so the two stories together, you kind of get the full picture. And so Judges chapter 2, these couple of sentences where he says, the angel of the Lord went up and spoke and said, you're not following the covenant. Then on the other hand, when you put the story of Joshua 24 together, it doesn't necessarily talk about the angel of the Lord, but it does talk about this same thing, and it's in that same area right there. But he's saying all the things that the Lord had told him, right? And so when you put Judges 2 together, you realize this was not just through prayer time or through the tabernacle, but literally the angel of the Lord had appeared to him again and spoken to him all of these things, how they're not fulfilling the covenant. And that's when he rallied everyone there. If you remember, Shechem was the place of the two mountains in the very beginning of Joshua. Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And Shechem is right in the middle. And they put the ark right there. And 6 of the tribes went on Mount Ebal, and 6 of the tribes went on Mount Gerizim right in the beginning. Right after they had defeated Jericho and Ai, then they come up here to Shechem and do this. So when the Bible says that Joshua rallied all of Israel when they weren't taking their inheritance and rallied them all back to Shechem to renew the covenant, this is what he means. So even though they don't really go into Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim again and go through all of that, they would have known, because in the very beginning of the battle, he took them there, and 6 tribes were on Mount Ebal, because Moses commanded them to do this. And then 6 tribes were on Mount Gerizim. And Moses says, when you get into the promised land, this is one of the first things you have to do. And so this is what Joshua did. And the tribes on Mount Ebal read out loud the blessing of God's covenant. And the tribes on Mount Gerizim read out loud the curses of God's covenant. And so at the end of Joshua's life, nobody has fully taken their inheritance. And so the angel of the Lord comes to him somewhere in this area, wherever this Bochum is, and starts talking to him about how they're not fulfilling the covenant. Because there's so much more that they could have that they're just not taking. And so he calls everybody back to the valley again, where they had done this before. And he tells them what God told them. In other words, he's reminding them, if you fully serve me, don't forget about all these blessings. That if you will turn your heart fully to me, because they had started to slip away into idolatry. He says, don't forget that we said this from the very beginning, that if you will serve me fully, you can have all of it. Because they were running into obstacles. They weren't having victory like they should have. And so God is reminding them that the reason is because you're not here, you're not fully serving me. Right? So this is Ebal, E-B-A-L, and Gerizim, and Shechem. And so Shechem is here. The interesting thing is Shechem is very close to Shiloh. In fact, the Bible says that from here Joshua then immediately at the same time also sacrificed at the sanctuary of the Lord, which would have been Shiloh, which was right near here. So somewhere along the way, Joshua moves his camp from Gilgal to Shiloh and right near Shechem, right? And so the angel of the Lord then appears to him again. So they had been at Gilgal for a while. Through the first initial stages when they were all together as a nation battling, Gilgal, that first place, was the base camp. And they would send everybody out from there, and that was base camp. After they had kind of gone through the major parts of the battle, Joshua moves base camp to Shiloh. And that becomes the place of the tabernacle. All the way through for many years was at Shiloh.
What would be the implication about them saying that the angel of the Lord came from Gilgal?
Right.
That's the last place they spoke to him, or that was his residence?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. That's why I say that's such an interesting statement there that you don't hear too many people talking about. It makes it seem like he was there the whole time. It is possible what it's saying is this is the last time that we saw him, and now he's here, so he went from there to here. Or it could be that, it could be other things. Maybe the angel of the Lord appeared to them periodically there at Gilgal. I don't know. But it is interesting. It says that he moved to this area. Yep.
Wasn't there also something with the name of Gilgal where it means reproach or something?
Roll away.
Roll away.
Yeah, that the reproach of Egypt is now rolled away from you because you're in the promised land now. And so Gilgal was their new city. Shiloh, though, is where they divvied up the land. If you remember, they had this thing, they all had to get their inheritance. And so they went there before the Lord, and that was at Shiloh. So somewhere along the way here, they've moved the camp from Gilgal to this area. And then at the end of his life, he has this other encounter with the angel of the Lord. So if the angel of the Lord was there in Gilgal the whole time, I don't know. It seems more like what they probably mean is we saw him at Gilgal the first time, and now that we've moved camp here, at the end of Joshua's life, he saw him again, and he spoke to him again. Is possibly what that means. It reads like he's just been there hanging out in Gilgal the whole time, but probably not, because the experience of meeting the angel of the Lord was so rare. For him to just be there doesn't seem like you'd think they would have talked about that a little more if the Lord was in a physical form, actually living among them in Gilgal.
Devotion in verse 5 says, so then they named the place.
Yeah.
Maybe
it means weeping, because when they heard that the Lord was saying, listen, you could have already had all this stuff, and you're not really following me with your whole heart, they weep. And so they called it Bochum. It's probably just the fields between Shechem and Shiloh, because this is where he called them, and then Shiloh is right over here, which is where the sanctuary is. So they had moved the sanctuary right near this. And then, so he calls everybody here, and then, so it could be that they're talking about Shechem, because that's where they would have been weeping from in 24, Joshua 24.
Spelling is almost like
The Shechem at the end of both of them, yeah.
Well, when you're reading this, and it says, and it's called that still to this day.
Right.
And this day is the day that they're reading this.
Mm-hmm.
It's written. So, and I think you mentioned it last week, they may say Bochum because we know that's where that
Yeah.
So it can really get,
And so they could be talking about Shechem and just saying, we renamed that place Bochum
and they say.
because of what happened,
everybody knows
you know.
what you're talking
And then at the time that they're writing it, you just assume everybody knows because everybody does know at the time they were writing it, you know.
about. That's poor guys, a couple thousand years
Later, trying to figure it out. All right, so let me, and I would encourage anybody, if I do tend to speak a little fast because I'm trying to get a lot of things in. So if at any point you ever don't catch something, just go back in and rewatch it. You know, if you rewatch it several times, you will eventually figure out what I'm talking about. My dog does that all the time.
Pause.
All right, so it'll be, yeah. All right, so I want to talk about Philistines for a minute, okay? That the Philistines, right? You know, when we looked at Genesis, are not even mentioned anywhere in the table of nations that God plans on driving out. And in fact, when Moses twice in the book of Exodus, Moses during his journeys kind of prophesies the nations that they're going to drive out, and he doesn't mention the Philistines at any point either. So we've got 3 different lists, 1 from Abraham and 2 from Moses, that describe the nations that will be driven out, and the Philistines are not mentioned in any of them. Right? Which is kind of interesting because they were already there before Moses wrote this stuff, because when they left Egypt, God said, I want you to go through the wilderness because the Philistines are there, and if you go through there, they're going to want to fight you. And so I want you to go around the Philistines. So we know they were there. And so one of the things that I think is interesting is there's another place where Philistines are mentioned before this. Anybody remember where it is? The famous person who had some dealings with Philistines before any of this stuff with Moses or any of that. It's before Moses. There was another encounter with Philistines. And Abraham, yeah. It was a Philistine leader that Sarah was taken in by. One was Pharaoh and one was a Philistine leader. And so Abraham had dealings with the Philistines, and so did Isaac then also later. In fact, some of the confrontations over the wells that Abraham had dug were with Philistine people as well. So you've got the encounters during Abraham and Isaac's time with Philistines, and then you don't hear about them much, and then you have in Moses' day they're there, and Moses and them don't really fight them. But during Joshua's day, you kind of see them battling it out there. And then particularly during Samuel, Saul, David, during those times, Samson, the Philistine presence is there. But it's very different. I mean, the Philistines seem to have peace with Abraham. In fact, they even made a covenant together of peace. Perhaps that's why they were not included in the list. But Abraham had a covenant of peace with the Philistines of his day. They seem like a very different people than the Goliath, I will kill you all, Philistines later. Although that's not entirely, it could just be that they were a smaller tribe back then, maybe not as warring, I don't know. Although Abraham was a little afraid of them, right? That's why he had Sarah lie. Yeah.
Maybe the Israelites had grown their numbers were more intimidating later.
It could have been more of a threat. That's possible. One thing that I would point out, though, is there are 2 streams of biblical texts, right? One is called the Septuagint. And that's just a fancy word. It will also be represented by LXX, which is Roman numerals for 70, because in 300 BC, about 300 years before Christ, Alexander the Great had conquered his known world, and people were speaking Greek all over the world, right? And so even Jews had been incorporated into the Greek culture. Paul spoke Greek. So they would speak Hebrew and they would speak Greek. But the trouble was there were a lot of Jews being born who didn't even fully speak the Hebrew language anymore. A lot of them just grew up in Greek culture, and that's just what they knew, right? Because the whole world was speaking Greek. So these 70 rabbis got together, and they said, we need to translate the Old Testament into Greek so it doesn't get lost. And so that all of these people that only speak Greek will be able to know what God has written down. And so these 70 created a translation from the Old Testament into Greek. And that's called the Septuagint. The reason that this is so important is because they translated this in 300 BC. I mean, they were Hebrews, and they were translating it in between languages that they knew, right? It's different from somebody 3,000 years later who grew up in America who is trying to look back into the world of the Hebrews and translate and trying to figure out what they meant, versus someone from that time who got together and translated it, right? So that's why the Septuagint is a very important tool for being able to know what was the early Hebrew intention of a word, right? Because these people that were translated, because we know Greek very well, right? Because Greek has endured, and so there's a lot of people that know Greek very well. So we can go in and read their Greek translation and figure out exactly what they were trying to say. And so it's a very helpful tool because there's another stream of text called the Masoretic text. Masoretic text. Now, this stuff is actually really important. If you've never heard of it, this is actually very important. There's a group of rabbis, a group of scribes. I mean, the Bible talks about groups of scribes and things in the New Testament. And so these people, it was their intention to copy the Bible and maintain the purity of the Bible, right? And so the Masoretes was what they were called. It was a group of scribes called the Masoretes. And so their copy that they kept, that they passed from generation to generation, was called the Masoretic text, right? The earliest copies of this are like, 500 AD. This was written in 300 BC. So this copy was, after, Rome had adopted Christianity as the world religion. After all the... say what now?
800 years later.
Yeah, 800 years, yeah. And so this was done 800 years before some of our earliest copies of this, right? So here's the thing. The King James and most of our modern translations only had access to this. And so most of our modern translations are based off of this line of text, what these scribes were produced to do. It's like what you'd see in a movie. They have their scribe thing, and they'd have a big desk, and they'd have parchments, and it was somebody's job to try and copy word for word these texts, and they did it for hundreds of years. And that is the surviving old copies that they had to draw from when they were doing the King James, right? Whereas this is much more accurate because it was the original Hebrews translating their own language into a new language, right?
Why
Yeah.
didn't they have
I don't know what if they just didn't have it. I don't know if it was just gone during that time or if they just preferred this one. But for whatever reason, they didn't have. In fact, we have it, but there's not much. In fact, I'm teaching a class on that next quarter for our hermeneutics students.
It was just so rare. So rare.
Yeah, it's rare even now. In fact, there's only that I'm aware of, like 2 English translations of this period, and one of them they botched. So the reason they botched is because they started with the base of the New Revised Standard Version, and then they would go back in and see if they needed making changes. Well, what's the trouble with that? The New Revised Standard Version is this one, and so they started with this one and then went back in. So it's okay, but it's not great. That's the most recent one. It was done just a few years ago. And then the only other one that you can really find is this guy that wrote one, like 30 years ago, and even his is, it's not great,
What text did the later translations go by? The original too? The Masoretic? Was that from the Septuagint translation or was from the original?
I don't think so. I think they were passing Hebrew to Hebrew. And so theirs was Hebrew to Hebrew. Now, the reason I want to point this out is because this one, because just it's just the style of copying and copying and copying, is a little more inaccurate with some things versus this one. And one of the areas that I think that's important in, it's not to say that these, obviously this is our Bible, so it's not like it's just riddled with problems or anything. But let me give you an example that applies to this. In the Masoretic family of texts, the people that Abraham encounters when Sarah goes to Abimelech, which was the name of the Philistine kings, like it wasn't his name, it was the title. Like Pharaoh was not the guy's name, it was his title. Abimelech was the title of the Philistine king. And so Sarah is taken by him. The Masoretic text, which is what our Bibles are today based off of, calls those Philistines. And then when David comes and he's fighting all these people in Gath and Ekron and all of those areas, the Bible calls those Philistines, right? The Septuagint does not do that. The Septuagint calls the people that Abraham is with Philistines. They have a different word entirely for the people that Samuel and Saul and David were fighting. It's a totally different word. They call them, and I'll spell it out here for you. ALLOPHULI. Yeah. That is the Hebrew word for other tribes. They don't really have a name for them. They called them other tribes. Whereas, probably not Hebrew, probably other peoples. Yeah. Almost perhaps, because what we know of, which takes us to our pictures, is that during this time, there were all these people from the Aegean Sea area, Turkey, these northern areas, that were bringing armies down into Canaan and into Egypt to try and take new territory. And so it is believed that the Philistines of David's day were some of these seafaring people that had migrated down into this region. And that it's just interesting that the Septuagint makes a clear distinction between these people that Abraham was encountering versus the people that David is encountering.
And that might have explained the difference in
Personality, yeah. And the other interesting thing, in Genesis, the Bible talks about the Philistines coming from the line of Ham, right? So you have Ham and Mezarim, and then this other guy, it's like Cushalim or something like that, in Genesis. Let me see if I could just grab it here. It's in the descendants of Noah. When it starts talking about Ham and all of that. It's chapter 10, verse 14. And let me just point out one interesting thing there, because most of our Bibles today put the parentheses after Kaloshim. You see that? And it says, and these came from there. And then the last one is Kaftarim. But what we don't know, because there's no punctuation in early Hebrew, is whether the parentheses is going to the one before it, or if it's something about the one before. Because there's no parentheses in Hebrew. There's no punctuation at all. There's no periods. There's no commas. Nothing. And so, in Jeremiah 47, verse 4, says something to the effect that we know that the Philistines came from Kaphir, a city called Kaphir, which would lead you to believe it's the second name, because his name is Kaftarim. And so, but the interesting thing is it's talking about these Philistines as coming from the line of Ham, right? Which means Mizraim, the one who gave birth to this guy who the Philistines came from, was the founder of Egypt, right? The Egyptian peoples, right? And so that fits better with this group that Abraham is running into, who live right there on the outskirts of Egypt, that Abraham is interacting with, as opposed to these people that have moved in on boats, we know during the time of David, from the northern areas of Greece and Turkey and those areas, because most of those places up there were where the tribes of Japheth went. All of the white people were up there coming down, and it's entirely probable that these Philistines were something either Semitic or Japhet. They don't seem to have been Ham. Another side note that's kind of interesting is the Philistines, a lot of these tribes from the earlier times, like when Joseph gets there, if you remember, Joseph uses an interpreter, right? Because his brothers didn't understand Egyptian, but he had learned it because he had lived there so long. And so his brothers use an interpreter. But then, interestingly enough, these Philistines move in, and David needs no interpreter. They all speak the same language. So that's another kind of, I guess what I want you to see is the origin of these Philistines in David's time is somewhat of a mystery. Like there's still some uncertainty surrounding who these Philistines really were, because by the time David is there, they all understand Goliath. They understand everything he says. David goes to the Philistine king, and he has conversations with them, and they fully understand each other. And so there doesn't seem to be any language barrier at all between the Philistines. Samson marries one of them, and they have no problems at all. And so it's just kind of interesting that this group somehow speaks the same language as the Israelites. And so it's kind of interesting to think who they were. This picture here, and I'll get you out of here within just a couple minutes. This is from these seafaring peoples, this top one. From Ramses III's tomb, it talks about a victory where all these people from the sea tried to also push down in as far as Egypt. And he pushed them back. And so, but that is a picture of them. And they came from the north, and they were fighting against them. And this is the battle down below, is what they drew the battle like. And you see all the boats that these people came in from. And so this fits with that description of these seafaring people that had come down from Turkey and those areas of Greece and had come down in trying to take land. And so we know that Ramses pushed them back and defeated them, right? And so either that was just a little before David's time, and so that's why they were no longer pushing south and they were trying to take land in David's area, or it was right after David came, and as David starts pushing them out, they might have looked for more land down in Egypt and been defeated. But either way, after David, you don't really hear from them again. David put them into subjection, and then the Assyrians came down who wiped out the 10 tribes, and they eliminated the Philistines. So they were never a people group after the Assyrians came down. And then that back one there, that is the original of the color picture that was on the other side with all the boats. And then this is just a sample of Philistine pottery. They always put those black lines on their stuff so that you would know it was Philistine, right? And so that's what all of the Philistine pottery would have looked like. And so I've got a few other things, but I know we're about running out of time. One of the other things is, in Abraham's day, we didn't have any mention of any of these Philistines being giants or anything like that, although you do see that in this group that came down with that. And then there's no mention of them as being enemies that are going to be driven out. So anyways, kind of interesting stuff about who were these Philistines. And then one kind of last thing, the champion fight that we see from Goliath, that was a very much something that was done in Greek culture. Like you think of not Ulysses, but Achilles. You ever seen the movies with Achilles where he has this battle, with champion versus champion? That was a very much a Greek mindset. And so these seafaring peoples, we believe, came down from those areas and became the Philistines of this time. Because you never see that in any of the Egyptian or any of the other things where they would just want to have a champion fight. That's much more of a northern kind of thing. And then the city-state structure that they have was Greek style too. The Greeks operated out of a city-state where you'd have not one king, but you'd have cities that had their own king, right? And so you don't see that in Israel, you don't see that in Egypt, you don't see that anywhere else except for in Greek and the Philistines. They had the 5 cities with the 5 lords, and they each had equal share. And so it seems that these people were descended from Greek culture, which would not have been Ham. That the Bible says the Philistines came from Ham. So that Genesis Philistines in the Septuagint is still Philistine. So in Genesis, when it's saying these people came from Ham, it is most likely referring to the Philistines that Abraham interacted with, that were like basically just Egypt's brothers. Whereas these Alafulo, or however you pronounce that came down during the time of Samuel and David, would have most likely been a totally different group from up north, probably a group of white Greek that came down in and began to fight in that region. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead. We'll get you guys out of here. I have a bunch of other stuff on the Philistines, but probably something like that. My Greek's a little Greek to me. But yeah, something to that effect. And which is, it's kind of just an interesting thought that there is a clear distinction in this line of text that is kind of lost over in this one. So it's not to say that this is wrong or anything, but it's just, this is intriguing to me that it's out there and it's available to be read, to kind of see how the people of that generation interpreted their Old Testament Bible.
Where is it out there to be read? Online?
If you, you'd have to buy it. It's a book.
Oh.
So there are 2 that I know of. Like if you went to Amazon and Googled Septuagint, there are 2 main ones. I think the guy's name is Brenton or something that wrote the older one, and then there's a new one that just came out a few years ago. But like I said, it's based off of the Masoretic text, and then they just made changes where they thought was important. So you may or may not get the full gist of what the Septuagint is, because it's up to their decision about what they thought should be changed from the Masoretic text to more reflect this one, as opposed to somebody that just went straight to this one and just did an English conversion, which is what that Brenton guy, I think is his name.
That's what he did.
Yeah, his was more of just a straight from the Septuagint. They're like $25, something like that.
And so there's only 2 of the originals?
Two. Like if you went to buy it, like somebody that's actually translated in English and you wanted to buy it, there's only like 2 choices.
Oh. Okay.
So I mean, in terms of the number of them, I mean, there are books out there for sale. I mean, there's probably thousands of them in terms of how many are available. But in terms of what there is, it's just the 2 people have taken the time to actually translate it.